Welcome to our Women in Leadership Fireside Chat series hosted by Arise Leadership. I am so excited today to speak with Liz Fosslien, leadership expert and author of Wall Street Journal bestseller, No Hard Feelings, and national bestseller, Big Feelings. Her work has been featured in Good Morning America, Harvard Business Review, and other top publications. You've probably seen her creative illustrations on social media. They are amazing and eye-catching and so insightful. So today we are going to talk about all types of feelings at work, including crying. And being a perfectionist without determining your self-worth, I can definitely relate to that. We're also going to talk about how do you create stability for your team in this environment without overpromising, a really time-sensitive topic. I'm so excited for our chat today. I am Shivani Berry. I am the CEO and founder of Arise. We offer an online leadership program for women. We've had graduates from Fortune 500 companies who've had a bigger voice at the table and moved up faster in their careers. Our mission is to elevate 1 million women into leadership. I think that's a big way we create this change that we just see in today's workplaces. And I find Liz's work so inspiring that I'm so excited to have her here because I think what she talks about is a really important part to create this change. I really think we need to have more open and honest conversations around what it takes to be successful at work. How do you succeed at work? How do you move into management? For example, I'm a big crier at work, so hearing Liz's insights about crying and how it's perceived was eye-opening for me. She has a wealth of wisdom and knowledge that I can't wait to hear. So today we're going to chat for about 30 minutes and do Q&A. So as we're going along, you can add and upvote questions. So just hit the Q&A icon that's on the bottom right of your screen. Liz, thank you so much for joining us today. Let's dive in. I'm so honored that you're here. And maybe we can get off by you introducing yourself, giving us a brief overview of your career.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So I studied math and economics. My parents, for context on the emotions at work research, are both pretty stoic immigrants. And so I got my, traditional quantitative degree, very solid, and then worked as an economic consultant after college. And it was very much, for me, the job that checked all the traditional boxes of success. It was in a big building. I put on my Banana Republic suit. I went up to a high floor. And it also had a really clearly delineated career path. So it was one of those like analyst, get a grad degree, associate, and so on. And for a lot of reasons, after 2 years, I really burnt out. And I think a primary reason was that I entered the workplace with this strong notion that to be successful, you should never feel, you should never fail, and you should never fuss. So I was really reactive. I didn't know, for example, you could ever talk to your manager and say something like, this is the kind of work that I love to do. How can I have more of it? Or are there interesting growth opportunities for me? Or especially even in your first job out of college, saying something like, this isn't the career that I want. Can you help me sort of talk to people or learn where I might want to shift my path? And looking back, I think my mentor and manager at the time would have been so open to that, but I just didn't know that was a possibility. And so that was really kind of burning out of this job. I ended up having like debilitating migraines towards the end of it. So it really manifested in a physical manner. That started this journey of, okay, had all these feelings. I tried to repress them. That didn't really work out for me. This was a job that I thought I wanted. Where do I go with my life? What did I do wrong? What could I have done differently? And that led me down this path of emotions at work. And yeah, like I said, in my research and my explorations, realized that wasn't the right job for me, but also there was a lot I could have done to make it more manageable and have it not have ended in such a basically catastrophe.
Yeah, I love that. I can totally relate to that. I mean, that's a big reason why I also started Arise Leadership, because like I wish I'd known all these things earlier, and we should just talk about it more. So I'm so inspired that you started to opening up these conversations. And let's dive into more of it. Things have felt especially turbulent lately with all the layoffs hitting tech, starting to spread to other industries. How can managers create stability for their teams in this uncertain environment without overpromising? I think that's always that tension. Like you want to provide that comfort, but it's obviously bad practice. And just like you lose trust if you're going to tell them everything's going to be okay when it might not actually be okay.
Yeah, totally. So I think that there's a real danger in overpromising, and it's very tempting. Often as a manager, as a leader, we want to be able to come and say, I have all the answers. I can guarantee you that you won't lose your jobs. And usually, you're not really in a position to say that, even if you're the CEO, right? The economy could change, lots of things could shift. And so the key is really to create stability for your team while also earning their trust, exactly as you described. So, specific ways to do that: one is to rally people around a 3-month mission. So, 3 months is usually long enough that it feels like there's some stability. People know what they're working towards for the coming quarter. But it's not so far off that it's going to wildly change. And you also should try to make that mission something that is more within your control. So, can we as a team try to deliver exceptional customer experiences? Maybe you don't even have control of that, like you don't have control of the product, there's a lot going on. Then you can make it, as a team, can we increase belonging? Can we have meetings be more equitable? Can we do something that's more focused on the internal culture? And the other thing that I actually did with my reports that I have found really helpful on both sides is asking them to go and find a listing with their dream job. So find a job listing, and this is a job that you want in 5 years and you don't yet feel qualified to apply for. And bring that back to me, and we'll go through the bullet points and we'll figure out which bullet points you don't feel like you can tell a story around. And what I commit to this person is that I will try to help you take on projects, take on work that helps you tell a story around those bullet points. And so I can't guarantee that you will have this job forever, but I can help you, whatever happens next, try to invest in the type of career that you want long term. And what's nice about that is, as a manager, it really crystallizes what that person wants to work on and helps you sort of better put them into growth opportunities. And for the person, it's really motivational, right? Like, you're much more motivated when you feel like you're working towards a goal, when you feel like this is going to actually matter in the course of your life. So those are two practices that I found really helpful. And again, both of them are very cognizant of the reality of any economic situation. They're not overpromising, but you are trying to commit to being a place of solace versus another source of stress for someone.
I love that. I love that, especially like just even just time box, like figure out what are your
Mhm.
parameters, what can you actually commit to, and provide commitments in that and provide stability around that. You know, on the flip side, I think as managers, often we feel like, I mean, we have so much anxiety ourselves,
Mhm.
and feel like we have to have it all together. Like I know when I was a manager, I felt like I had to have all the answers. I couldn't show I was stressed. Like, what do you recommend for managers to do to combat their anxiety?
Yeah, so it's a really fine line between sharing and oversharing. And so, one of the recommendations in No Hard Feelings that my co author Molly and I share is practicing something called selective vulnerability. So, that's exactly, it's opening up without burdening your people, right? So, in one sense, you as a manager, maybe you're not sleeping at night, maybe you're really stressed out, you're wondering if people even can like you in the current economic conditions when there's so much going on. And so, something that's not going to improve your authority is to show up and say all that, right? Like, I didn't sleep last night. I'm exhausted. Do you even like me? I need validation from all of you. You're just not going to be the kind of leader that people trust to guide them through challenging situations. But you also shouldn't show up like a robot and pretend like nothing's wrong, because people can read you usually better than you even think they can. And so, selective vulnerability is pairing openness with a path forward. So it's showing up and saying something like, "This is really hard, right? Like, we don't really know what's going to happen with the economy. There's a lot of changes going on within our organization. I'm feeling it too. Please let me know how I can support you. However, here's what we're going to do over the next 3 months to try to sort of chart the course forward to create stability for ourselves. And here's some specific steps." And what's nice about that is you acknowledge the emotions, you share what you're going through, but then you quickly pivot into, as a leader, I also have it together enough. I've really thought through how I can support you and where we're going from here. And so that's really a nice, I often speak with very sort of traditional audiences. So the military, law firms, investment banks, and they love this formula approach, right? Where it's like, moment of openness, like, here's what I'm feeling, here's why, and then here's a path forward, and here's what I'm going to do, here's what I need from you.
I really love that. And around and kind of like showing like here's like what you shouldn't do versus like be like I'm
Mhm.
exhausted, but like kind of figure out like what's and then like how do you move forward from that? How do you think about like what is your advice on thinking about like what is someone we're afraid like someone will judge? Like how do you figure out like when is the right time to be vulnerable
Mm.
versus not and figure like determine like what's a safe space around that? Like I've had colleagues where, like executives of my company, if like if I told them I was like stressed and here's what we're gonna do about it, like I think they might just see me as weak, or at least maybe that's
Mm.
how I'm perceiving it. So like if you're in this kind of environment, what's your advice for how to navigate that?
Yeah, so I really love that you mentioned the word environment because a lot of this comes down to figuring out what academics call the emotional culture that you work in. And there might actually be a really different emotional culture between you and your direct teammates versus you and your manager or you and another team. And this comes up a lot, like a very traditional, like, or not traditional, but specific example of hospitals where nurses might joke around in the break room and then might have a really and should probably have a really different attitude when they're with among patients. So there's two different cultures that exist within the same organization. And so if you figure out that you have a manager who is not going to be as receptive to talking about emotions, especially if you're a manager, you can usually find a way to flag what's going on and ask for support without ever talking about feelings if you first address or you only address the need driving those emotions. So in one world, I could go to my manager and say, I'm really anxious. My team seems super burnt out. I'm just concerned about their well-being. That unfortunately might not go over amazingly well with every boss. And so you could instead say, hey, we have these big deadlines coming up. People have been working really hard, and I'm seeing that the amount that they're working is starting to affect their performance. So, can we potentially give them like a half day off? Or can you help me prioritize so that I can take that back to my team and make sure that they're actually focusing on the most important things and deprioritizing things that don't matter as much? And so, one conversation, it's the same thing. It's basically just like my people are struggling and they need help, or even I'm struggling and I need help, but you can frame it in two very different ways. And one is leading with the emotions, which again, with some managers might be great. And you might have built that trust over time. With others, you might have to go in with it's affecting motivation, performance, productivity, whatever buzzword they're going to care about most. But I think that's the sign of a great sort of person who knows how to operate within different environments is, can you frame it in a way that will land most effectively? It essentially comes down to storytelling.
I was like, yeah, that I really love that, especially that like nurse example is such a like I think we can all imagine that just like there I had a visual popping in my mind as you were like talking through that because you're right, like you see them just like chatting with each other, but then with like their patient, they're just much more like I don't want to say serious, but like more professional and kind of and just
Mm-hmm.
like okay, here's what we need to do, and still very caring. And so I really love that, and I love how you're calling out for a manager. It's really important. Like it sounds like a really great manager is able to understand the room's environment essentially,
Mm-hmm.
where like okay, with this stakeholder, if I need to get this is like I need to lead with emotion versus like this one I need to like not. Is there any times like what do you do when you maybe make the wrong judgment call on this and you
Hmm.
like start leading with emotion and then your manager's then like the exec is like we're not going to talk about that. I don't know. It just like blows up in your face.
Yeah, I would, I would take it as a learning lesson, as a way to be figuring out what that emotional culture is or how you should be leading conversations. And so, yeah, if there's something and it blows up in your face and they don't seem receptive, I think it's probably wait till the next week, give it some time, and then try approaching it from a different angle. So again, that's the reframing element. I think it's tough. It's sometimes tough to read. And I would say, especially if you're in an environment where you're new, you're still trying to figure things out, it's usually better to err on the side of not leading with strong emotions. So, anytime people hear about emotions at work, they often think that I'm just going to come in and be like, everything you feel, you should say. To be authentic is to say exactly what's on your mind. But I always say it's not to be a feelings fire hose. It's to talk about emotions without becoming emotionally leaky. And especially if you're a manager, your responsibility is to authentically figure out how to best get support for what your team needs, how to best get your point across, get visibility for your team's work. And that might often mean not expressing as much emotion as you normally do.
Oh, yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. Let's switch gears a little bit. One thing I've been like really excited to talk to you about is about crying at work. Because as
Mhm.
I mentioned, I'm a big crier at work. I know many people are, but I can feel very. I know often it's like I lose credibility in the moment often. And so I'm curious, like you've done a bunch of research around crying, so would love to hear your advice on it, thoughts, and like and perceptions in the workplace.
Yes. So, first of all, Um, so there was a researcher who did a lot of studies around crying. And first of all, everyone has cried at work or about work at least once in their career. So it's very common, even though there is still a lot of stigma. And I almost want to say well, I won't make a claim, but there's stigma and I think there's a lot of shame around it. So even if other people don't necessarily care, we blame ourselves a lot for losing it, for losing control.
Yeah,
So
I
the
definitely
interesting
felt that
research.
as I was like saying I was like, oh, I'm a
Yeah,
crier at work,
yeah,
instead of being like, yeah, I cry at work. And
yeah,
that actually comes up a lot in like our leadership program. And when someone brings up like the tears and like crying at work, like there's just like hundreds of people and like and just like commenting, like tons of people just being like, oh my God, me too, me too, me too. So I hear
yeah.
you, and like you're not alone in doing that.
Yeah, so I think that's useful to know. You're totally not alone. And yeah, I was going to say, anytime that I do a talk like this or give a presentation and I don't mention crying at work as part of it, it's always the first question that comes up in the Q&A. So very similar story. So two things. One, there is research that shows that if you reframe crying as passion, so instead of getting ashamed about it, coming back and saying, "Look, I cried because I really care about this." And so when my project was descoped or when something happened with someone on my team, that was just me showing how much passion I have for my work and for supporting the people around me. And that's usually crying then is seen as much more positively than if I either never say anything again or say, oh, I was sad or I just got flustered, really shaping it around this is where that emotion came from. It really came from, again, a deep place of caring. And the second piece of research that I love and really resonates with me is the difference in why. So the research treated gender as binary, so people who identify as men, why they cry, and people who identify as women, why they cry. And so they asked men, why do you think people cry at work? And men said, I think they cry because they're sad. And then when they dug into that a little more, men tended to not want to give women harsh feedback or criticism, which you need to improve, even though it doesn't feel good to hear it. They didn't want to give that to them because they were afraid that women would cry because they were sad. And when the researchers asked women why people cry at work, women almost unanimously said because they're angry or frustrated. And so, very different perceptions of crying. And when I read that, I was like, yes, every time I've cried, it's because I've just been so pissed. It's like I'm not being heard. This isn't working. You don't understand what I'm trying to say. And that's when I start getting really teary eyed and upset. And so, I think it's just it's just useful to share that because again, I think it helps people not feel so alone and hopefully helps men understand that they might be making the wrong assumption. But it's also a good anecdote around questioning our assumptions. Often when we see a certain emotional expression in the workplace, we immediately assume we know where it's coming from. So for example, disengagement, we might say, oh, this person is slacking or they're lazy, when in fact it might mean that they're going through something really hard with their family, that there's something about the work that feels overwhelming to them. You don't know. And so it's really useful when someone has a strong reaction, especially if you're their manager, to give them space and then come back and say, hey, I noticed you had a strong reaction. Can you talk to me a bit about why and what I can do to support you? So it's just exploring that as opposed to leaping to a conclusion and then acting based on this thing, right? Like the men withholding feedback based on a completely incorrect assumption. That's really dangerous in the workplace.
Yeah, for sure. And let's say like you do cry, like what do you do
Mhm.
when the tears come?
Yeah. So you can, if you can, just give yourself space. And so that often means excusing yourself, going to the bathroom. It, can mean like walking around the block. My friend did this. She didn't cry, but I thought this was just such a beautiful example because often when you start crying, maybe you're not in a place where you can just be like, hey, excuse me, I need to like sleep on it and I'll get back to you tomorrow. I'm going home. And so what she did is we were all at dinner and someone said something that was vaguely offensive. And she just said, I'm having a strong reaction to your words and I need a moment. And I just loved that. It was creating space and also flagging that something had happened that was not okay. But she gave herself that moment to collect herself and have a response versus a reaction. And so if you start crying, it's totally fine to say, like, I need a minute, or excuse me, I'm going to go to the restroom. And I think so. There's many ways to excuse yourself to create that space. I think the big important piece is not to ignore that it happened. And so you don't necessarily need to go back to that person, but you can. So it's usually like, where did this emotion come from? Why did it happen? And what can I do to help that situation? So maybe it was because you felt like you weren't being heard. So maybe you go to your manager and you say, I had a strong reaction because I felt like you weren't hearing what I had to say. And it's really important to me that we kind of communicate better. Maybe you don't have a manager who's going to be receptive to that. And then you start to figure out, like, okay, how can I better phrase or how can I reframe what I wanted to say in a way that they might be more open to listening? It might also be in extreme examples, like you just need to find a new manager and a new job, right? But it's really, really important. All of our strong emotions are telling us something. And so it's useful to sit with that. And also, if you're a manager, someone cries in your office. I talked to one person and I love this, and she actually has on her desk, close to the chair where someone would sit to speak with her, she has a box of tissues, which she's like, it's totally fine if you cry. The tissues, that's why they're here. So I love that normalization. But as a manager, saying, like, hey, why don't you take some time? But I really do want to come back to this and understand where this reaction came from. And again, how I can support you, because it's usually because there's something big going on and it's important to figure out what that is.
Yeah. Oh, that really resonates with me. I'm like, as you were talking, I was like remembering this time earlier in my career when I was in a like one-on-one with our CTO. And we're like, to your point about like, it's usually something's going wrong or something's happening at work
Hmm.
that's triggering it. And we were working on like a stressful project, like really high visibility. And I started crying and I could feel the tears coming, but I thought I could just power right through it. And then I just like started crying and then I excused myself to the bathroom. And I think if in that moment, like if I had just been more in control where, the things that you just said, like, I just need a moment, like if
Hmm.
I just like gone to the bathroom like right when I felt my face heating up, it would have been changed. And then also having my manager tell me like, that's okay. Like like
Hmm.
exactly what you just said was like, I like, let's take a moment and like, we can revisit this. I'd love to see like, kind of like, where's this reaction coming from? Or,
Hmm.
would be so powerful. And I think it would help me even feel more comfortable in the moment.
Hmm.
Because usually I
Yeah.
start crying a lot more because I'm panicking and
Yeah.
I feel like things are going off the
Totally.
rails.
And I think that's something that's really important to talk about when it comes to emotions at work, which is there's so much around essentially self management, where it's like, what do I do if I cry? What do I do if I get angry? What do I do? And usually those are strong responses to some kind of structural element. And so it's really important to also address, like, well, what can the people around you do to support you, right? It's like you cried probably because someone was doing something, and so the answer isn't always like, well, you should just get better at not crying or you should work through it by yourself. It's also like, well, what can that person do to not put you in that situation again? And so, yeah, I always like to talk about the two sides, like what can you do and what can the person in a position of power higher than you do?
Yeah. Yeah. Have you like, and now as like you've been talking about this with, you're talking about this at like amazing companies, at more kind of like quote unquote old school organizations also, like how are you seeing people's like reactions? Like what are you kind of like, are you seeing a shift or is it still the burden falling more on the individual to like be able to like manage this if it happens in the moment and be able to like react to it?
Yeah, I would say there's definitely been a shift towards being more open about emotions and learning some of these softer skills. I think the pandemic really accelerated that, where it suddenly people were working from home. It became impossible not to talk about feelings because there were so many of them. And also, I would say, like, people were kind of going through the same thing all at once, which was unusual in history. So it made it easier to talk about feelings versus if I'm going through something really hard and you're not going through that, it's sometimes harder for me to open up about that versus if we're both going through the same thing. So definitely more softening, more opening up towards these emotions. I do still think, and again, this is not because people are poor, like have bad intentions. In some cases, it is, but I think the reason that organizations often turn to these one-off things, like here's a meditation app, here's a extra day of vacation, and this should solve all your problems, and those are great. Like I think both of those can be really helpful, but they're usually not addressing sort of the structural issues that are causing burnout, that are causing work overload. um, but it's really hard to tackle those, and it takes a long time. I've been doing this now for a decade, more than a decade, and there are still moments when I'm like, oh, I did not show up in the way that I wanted to, or I should ask someone because I don't know that I handled that perfectly. Because there's every situation is so unique. There's so much context. Everyone brings their own identity, their own history, their own upbringing, socialization. So I think it's just like, it's a lot of work to get it right. And we should be doing that work, but that's where I think it comes. It's just like, oh, it's just easy to like, let's just throw the meditation app at them and hope it works. And so, yes, keep doing the meditation app, keep giving more vacation days. But I think it's so, so crucial, especially as we talk about like AI and all these technological shifts where work is going to get more and more human, more about collaboration and creativity, to be investing in building those softer skills.
Yeah, that completely resonates, and I really love that. I love to shift gears a little bit because I think
Mhm.
many of us here are perfectionists, self-proclaimed perfectionists, and so when something goes wrong or it doesn't happen like we expected, we feel like we failed. And how do you detach your self-worth from what you're doing? I think that's a topic that comes up often in the
Mhm.
leadership program, even here, and so I'd love to hear your insights on that.
Yeah, I want to add one way that perfectionism tends to manifest, because this is how it manifests for me, which is I think I'm actually pretty good at when I make a mistake, being like, this is a learning opportunity. I'll come back. I can be resilient. It's fine. For me, it's that, and I've gotten a lot better over the years, but it used to be very much so that I felt like my confidence was like a gas tank with a giant hole in it, where I would achieve something and feel really good, and 3 hours later I'd be like, more, I need more. Otherwise, I'm not good enough. I need to keep proving myself. And so it was like it just never ended, right? I kept being like, once I get this promotion, once I hit this milestone, I'll feel like I've made it and I can finally relax. And it would just be like, nope, that all that satisfaction would be gone 24 hours later. So I just want to throw that out there in case other people feel that, because that is how perfectionism really manifested for me. And so I think one thing that's really useful is sort of trying to understand where you learned that. Like, where did you learn that you needed to do XYZ to be enough, to be loved, to be cared about, to show up in this way, to be perceived as smart, whatever it is you're working towards. Another question that is really useful for me is, what do you want or need free of other people's expectations? So if you were in a bubble and you couldn't post about a thing on LinkedIn, and you couldn't call your parents and tell them, and you couldn't tell your friends, what would you want to do? And usually when I asked myself that, it was like, I just want to lie in bed and do absolutely nothing for a day. But I felt like I couldn't do that. And when I actually did take a Saturday off and do that, I felt so much more energized afterwards. So I think that's a really important question. And then the final piece is, this is this is like the economics part of me that's so nerdy, but maybe it's not so nerdy, but it's kind of like, if you think about where you invest your time, it's like de-risking your portfolio. So if you're only investing your time in your career, it's going to feel really, really bad when you don't get the promotion that you wanted. When you achieve something, you're just going to always want more and more and more. Versus if you're still investing in your personal relationships, in your pets, in your hobbies, in your whatever it is, and you hold that sacred, that's going to balance out. It's going to be a place that you can turn to when you make a mistake, when you don't get what you wanted, when you feel like your confidence is draining. So for me, for example, my illustration work used to be very therapeutic. It still is somewhat, but it's turned a lot into like, how many likes did this get? Like I'm not, like I still get affected by metrics. And so now I have a baby, so I'll spend time with him, with my husband, but I also do a lot of painting, and I expressly like never hang it up anywhere. I never show it to anyone. I never post about it, because I just want to hold that sacred of like, this is for me, and it's not about any external validation. It's just a way for me to just like express myself, put something into the world, and it just doesn't matter what happens to it. And so I think it's like, what do you need free of expectations? Where did you learn this, and how can you unlearn it? And then, like, are you still investing in parts of your life that are not so dependent on validation to make you feel
Wow. So many good wisdom bombs in there.
good?
That was super helpful. I really love, well, now I'm also really curious to see your paintings, but I won't ask because I will respect
Nobody
that
gets
privacy.
to.
But like, I really love that, doing things just for you and not needing that validation around it, and just thinking about like, why are we feeling like this? Because you're so right. Like, every time I have this, I'm like, oh, I wanted to achieve this one thing. Then when I achieve it, I'm like, yeah, okay, that actually wasn't that hard. Like, I just like
Mhm,
discount it so much. And then I'm like, on to the next thing, on to the next thing, on to the next
mhm.
thing. And so really thinking about like what is actually driving that. And then, like you said, like figuring out something outside of work, for example, that will like motivate you or kind of guide you. I like that. So such a practical tip. And it sounds so simple, but like we don't think
Mm-hmm.
about it. And so it's like very just like how you sharing is like totally light bulb. And like I see the chat's on fire and loving it too. So thank you so much for sharing that. Now, last question for you before we dive into questions from the group. What is the secret to being authentic in a remote environment, especially like where body language is hard to be perceived? You're not really seeing people a lot except for maybe like in a Zoom grid once in a
Mm-hmm.
while. So what's your advice to being the secret to being authentic in a work environment?
Yeah, I think it's one, building moments of like being very intentional about building non-work moments in. So here's an example is on my team, we have a weekly team meeting. The first 5 minutes, we always someone asks a question that everyone can answer. And what I mean by that is like, what food is underrated? Do you believe in ghosts? Yes or no? Versus like, what's your favorite golf course? I don't know a favorite golf course. So that's what I mean by a question everyone can answer. And it's a rotating role. So every week someone new from the team has to bring in the question. And what's nice is it's like a stupid little exercise, not stupid, but it's silly. But it really gets people to open up. It's shocking how much you can learn from people. I also once did the prompt that I brought was like, you have 10 seconds to grab something that's near you, and then you have to share what it is and how it ended up on your desk. And so it's just like a fun thing. And you go down these little rabbit holes that you probably wouldn't have gone through, but that you probably would have stumbled upon if you were getting coffee in a kitchen together or walking from one meeting to the next. So a lot of it is building in those moments of intentionality. And part of that is also just going to the thing you don't want to go to. And what I mean by that is a lot of organizations that I've spoken with that are in a distributed setting or even hybrid, they'll do like virtual happy hours or virtual coffee or virtual lunch with the team. And I totally get that it is so easy to not go to that because you're like, I don't need to go to this. It's like Thursday and I have so much stuff left to do and I really want my weekend and I've been in back-to-back meetings. The last thing I want to do is get on this Zoom call and talk to people about nothing. Like there's no structure. And so one, you can add structure. So I think it's actually nice to have prompts. And two is like, just go to the thing. Even if you go for 10 minutes, I think it's usually surprising how much you enjoy it and how much you walk away from it feeling better, feeling more connected to the people around you. And then also not forgetting about like Slack or other platforms that don't require video or talking. So in my company, we also have a channel called Cheers for Peers, where anytime someone does something nice for you or just helps you out, you can shout them out and cheers for peers. And what's great about it is it's sort of self-perpetuating because the moment you get shouted out, it feels so good that you're then inspired to do it for someone else in the following days. So it requires a lot more intentionality. I think it does unfortunately require people to sort of, it's like okay, I'm gonna try, and it doesn't feel good up until you're actually doing it, and then it usually actually is really fun.
Yeah, that's so good. I'm going to introduce, we already do some of like the questions in our team
Mm,
meetings, but I'm going to make that a more regular thing. Cause you're right. It just like, we just get to like know like more fun things about people, like it's like even like, what's behind your camera, like your desktop, you like
mhm,
always see is this way and like what's happening on the
mhm,
other side. You're like, oh, and then it came out like in our conversation, it was like one person was like, I listen to like, I always have Netflix or something on in the background while I work because I like just see the news. And
mm.
I had no idea because I don't hear it during the meeting. So,
Whoa, yeah.
and so it was just like interesting, like, or people like who constantly have headphones to listen to music while they're working and when they're not in a meeting, like it just kind of surfaced all these new things that came out of a random question. I don't even remember what the question was anymore.
Mhm,
I think that really resonates, and I really appreciate the practical tips that you're sharing right now, like the cheers for
mhm,
peers, that like the questions, and also like just thinking about like what's a question that everyone can answer, because I agree on the golf
mhm.
course, I wouldn't know. I always like
Yeah.
read the sports questions. I'd be like, I don't have any idea what we're talking about here.
Yeah. Another
So
question that was just being thoughtful about them. I remember someone asked a question that was like, would you rather go back in time 100 years or forward in time 100 years? And that was a very diverse team. And like a large portion of the team was like, I don't want to go back 100 years. Like, and so I think just being thoughtful too about, yeah, just how would people respond to this question?
yeah, I love that. So I see a bunch of great questions coming in from the chat. One thing, when we were just talking about perfectionists, I think related to that is a question from Heather around how do we disregard our successes and move to the next thing instead of allowing ourselves to feel the achievements. So instead of like, as I was sharing, like I just tend to like move on. I'm like, yeah, I got promoted. Okay, like, yeah, it's
Hmm.
not that big a deal. Now I need to get the next promotion or whatever that is. Like, what's your advice for getting us to like just relish in that achievement and appreciate that?
Yeah, I think some of it is actually being very focused on looking back. So I think especially when you're a high achiever, type A type person, you're always looking forward. So I've done this. Where can I go from here? Where can I push myself? What's next? And actually taking a moment to say, okay, I got this promotion. Where was I 5 years ago? Where was I 3 years ago? Did I ever think this would be possible? Like, did I, or how, like thinking back and really remembering how much you wanted it at a certain time, I think that can help us be like, oh, this is really amazing. It's not just a thing that happened. It took a long time to get here. And I've been wanting this for a while. Other things are, creating rituals around them. So if there's something that you really wanted to buy for yourself, it's a perfect excuse, treating yourself to something, allowing yourself to have that moment of this is worth celebrating. And then yeah, I think those are the two that have been really effective for me. It's really hard. I will say that too. Like I said, if you are used to achieving and striving your whole life, you're not going to just immediately stop in a moment and be like, I'm very content with where I am. And so I think a lot of it is just allowing yourself to let go for a day or for a weekend and allowing yourself the time and space to celebrate what has happened. And I think that's when it's easier to really sink in of like, oh, this is really cool.
Yeah, for sure. I love that. I think just like forcing yourself to create that space around it
Hmm.
feels like a big part of this. And, last question for you is there's a big theme of burnout coming up. I think people, especially, with the pandemic and then like the markets, there just seems to be like one thing after another after another. And so, what is your advice for how should we handle burnout? How do we what are like things that we should think about to set up the right environment for our teams, but also for ourselves to manage that?
Yeah, so big piece is not creating an emergency where there is none. And so often there are fire drills, and often you do need to turn something around really quickly. But I've seen this in myself, I've seen it in everyone that I know of this. I have to do this right now. And when you actually check that assumption, you don't necessarily have to do it. So if someone emails you, I always, when someone emails me with a request, and I've gotten better at this, but I get this adrenaline rush of like, oh my gosh, when am I going to do this? And often when I email back and say, when do you need this by? It's not for 2 weeks, right? But in my head, I'm like, okay, how am I going to fit this in today? And I think that's a big component of burnout. I've also seen this of people, and of course, like it depends on your financial situation, but people who don't need to jump into a new job, they will end their job on a Friday and start the next Monday. And I'm always just like, just take the week. When you look back on your life, you are never going to, like, it just doesn't matter, you know? And so I think that's another example of creating urgency where there is none, where you probably would benefit from some time to unplug, recharge, and show up as like a more not burnt out person. And then I think as a manager, looking for ways to help your team prioritize. So it's much easier to go on vacation, to close your laptop at the end of the day if you feel like you've made measurable progress towards things you know are important to the company or your manager. And so that is like setting clear expectations, setting clear priorities, setting clear non priorities. One thing, so this is a very specific tip I'll also give. If you're a team that gets a lot of requests from other teams. So for example, I sit officially in the marketing function. We get a lot of requests from sales, and they're always urgent. They're always marked urgent. And so what I did is I created a form and I said, if you have a request for us, fill out this form. And there's like, you can mark how urgent it is and we will get back to you. And simply adding this small barrier of a form like reduces the amount of requests by 80%. It's absolutely bonkers how it's like, okay, it couldn't have been that important if you couldn't take the 30 seconds to fill out the form. But it's thinking of things like that where again, you're not removing the option of helping. You're not saying we're not going to do this. It's just putting structures in place and also often putting small barriers in place where I'm really going to sort of stress test how urgent this really is. And if you can't fill out the forms, it wasn't crucial to the company's success. So yeah, I think finding small things like that can be really helpful.
I love that. Like, if you can't fill out the form, then it's probably not that urgent. And you're right. Like,
Yeah.
I think our instinct, just in like the world we live in right now, is like instantaneous. Everything has to be
Hmm.
instantaneous. And so, like, just taking a step
Hmm.
back and thinking about, like, does this actually have to be done right now? Or like, what is that realistic timeline around it? This has been amazing. Thank you so much, Liz, for joining us. Like, super insightful, so many wisdom bombs. The chat is on fire. It's like really just like, I think all your insights, one after the other, we were like, yes, 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 yes. I love that. I can totally relate. So I super appreciate that. Big thanks to everybody for joining and for your great questions and for the amazing discussion. Yeah, Rox, these like so many gems. Like everybody's like, just really, really loving what you shared. You're an inspiration, Liz. And so thank you so much for joining. Everyone, we'll send out the recording so you can like keep rewatching this. I know I'm going to take a ton of notes after I rewatch this too. Thank you again. Bye, everyone. Take care.
Thanks for having me. Bye.